Thank you for tuning in to the Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. Translation studies is an academic interdiscipline dealing with the systematic study of the theory, description, and application of translation, interpreting, and localization. After I talked with Tierry Groensteen, whose work on comic theory was translated and introduced to the Anglophone world by Bart, Beaty, and Nguyen, today I speak with these two translators who will share with us their experience and insights of translating theory. Welcome, Bart and Nick. Thank you so much for joining the show. Could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is Bart Beaty, and I am a professor in the Department of English at the University of Calgary in Canada.
Hello, my name is Nguyen. I am an archivist at an international organization that's situated in Brussels, Belgium.
So good to have both of you on the show. First of all, where can we situate the Franco-Belgian school of visual semiotics within the continental philosophical tradition? And where can we place Groensteen in the Franco-Belgian school of this field?
I think understanding the origins of the study of comics in the Franco-Belgian tradition really comes out of a combination of two forces that overlap. So there is the semiotic tradition on the one hand, where we can think of Roland Bart or Umberto Eco as important forerunners, but also sort of paradoxically a fan-driven phenomenon, where in the 1960s we began to see highly educated comic book fans organizing knowledge for the first time in non-academic sectors, but in ways that echoed in some ways the traditions of academic scholarship. So we begin to see the first organizations of exhibitions of comics art. We begin to see fan historians coming together to develop publishing histories, checklists of important works, and so on. And these organizations, kind of loosely based around Paris in the 1960s, begin to publish fanzines, fan magazines, organize symposia, organize workshops, and so on, and begin the struggle to understand the formal elements of comics in a way that really echoes the work that was being done in film studies. Comic studies in France and Belgium, I think, owes a lot to the experience of film studies from a decade prior. And so if we think, and if your listeners think, for instance, of the development of writing, of academic writing on film that comes out of the Cinematheque and filmmakers like Godard and Truffaut and so on, who become the kind of professionals who are tied into and lead the way in some ways for the academics. The same thing happens on the comics side. Groensteen arrives much later than that, so he's not someone who's involved in the 1960s, but he comes out of that same tradition. So he was the editor of Cahiers de la Bande Dessinée, which was a non-academic magazine about writing about comics, had criticism, had interviews with important artists, and so on. But under his leadership, really became more and more nuanced and sophisticated and analytic, and started to take on bigger and bigger questions surrounding the role and operation of comics. And so as he and his colleagues at that magazine started to explore these questions, I think it was a natural inclination of his to drive it further and further to the point that he decided to do his dissertation in this area. But by the time he started writing what became a system of comics, there were a couple of decades worth of fanish and semi-professional semiotic analysis in France and Belgium for him to draw on and respond to.
In terms of echoes, Groensteen comes along at a specific moment, let's say in history and in time, where he's following, this lead. And again, his first monograph comes along in 1980, and he actually he organizes a major comic symposium in 1987. which gathers one of the first kind of large, gatherings of both cartoonists and theoreticians and practitioners. And if I'm not mistaken, Système de la bande dessinée is also his dissertation as well that he submits in the late 90s, which then becomes published in 99 as Système de la bande dessinée.
Mm-hmm. Well, Groensteen's work is deemed as groundbreaking in terms of the operation of the language of comics, and I believe so is its translation. Could you guys talk about what this translation means for the Anglophone world of comic studies?
I looked it up just the other day to see how widely this work had been taken up, because you always get your own impressionistic sense. And I noted that it had more than 1,300 citations at this point, which is really gratifying. I think the book really came out at a time when, in the English speaking and reading world, the major formalist work on comics was Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. And Understanding Comics is a fascinating book. It is used as the kind of introductory textbook in many, many, many introductory comics classes at universities around the world. But it has a lot of limitations. I've used it as a textbook dozens of times in my own courses, and I find with that book you constantly introduce students to these ideas, and then you say, well, hold on, there are these reservations that we might have about it, because McCloud is not an academic. He is a cartoonist himself. He's an autodidact, and so it's an interesting book, but with limitations. Groensteen's book was really received in some ways as a rejoinder to McCloud, even though I don't think in any way he set out to write it that way. McCloud isn't that discussed in the book, but it became sort of the second dense theoretical work on comics form. And so people who were attracted to writing on that topic were going to cite one or the other or both of those works. And so some of his ideas, I think, have really moved into the mainstream of comics study, partly because for about a decade, the study of comics form was probably the driving issue in comic studies. That is, that scholars were trying to create a language that would separate comic studies from other fields like literary studies or film studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, the point about McCloud and the timing, if I remember correctly, McCloud is 95. Prior to that, one of the main textbooks was again by another artist, Will Eisner. So that pretty much dominated a lot of the terms that, again, that were circulating. And again, before even comic studies becomes an actual thing, as an accredited field of discipline in the North American university system. I mean, at most, if I remember correctly, and Bart, please correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of comics work being done at the academic level at that time was coming out of English departments. So finding useful vocabulary, specific academic, if you want to call it vocabulary or jargon, is pretty nascent at this moment in time. So the timing, again, I'm all about the timing of of Groensteen's book, arriving in a French context, and then finally, and I think that was part of the reasons why it was selected for translation. It's like, hey, now's as good a time as any, as things are starting to grow, that we can start offering alternative, European continental perspectives on this growing field.
I would just add to what Nick has said. He's absolutely right that there's been the dominance in comic studies in the North American context, that the work comes out of literature departments, whether English Lit or Comp Lit or French language programs and so on. And that meant initially that a lot of the early scholarship, it would talk about thematic elements and so on that are very familiar to scholars in literature departments. But a lot of those scholars did lack a specific terminology and lens through which to read the visual elements. And so I think Groensteen's analysis of visual elements, his consideration of the page as the basis of meaning, the way that he talks about braiding and weaving across time and through works and so on, ideas like mise-en-page become very important to English, to people trained in English that might have lacked the background in art history, but still need to talk about the visual elements of an art form that is primarily visual.
How did you guys find his thesis, his dissertation, and what inspired you guys to translate this book? And when was that initial recognition that, wow, this is a brilliant work and it's going to bring so much impact on the world of comics and it needs to be translated into English immediately?
Now, I had met Tierry Groensteen, probably dozens of times before I'd done the work. I think the first time I would have met him would have been at the ICAF conference, which in the 90s was the only kind of dedicated scholarly conference about comics held every year in North America. And Thierry was brought over in the late, I want to say about 97 to Washington, D.C. to give one of the keynote addresses. I remember he was there with the cartoonist Claire Bretéché as the international guest of honor. I remember sitting on the back of a bus as we were being taken somewhere to go and see an exhibition somewhere in Washington, and to a couple of the events at that conference. So I'd known him for quite some time, and I would see him every year at the Anglophone Comics Festival at the end of January. Every year, the largest comics festival held in France. So we were acquaintances. I was aware of his work. I remember buying his book when it came out and reading it with interest, and then being asked by the University Press of Mississippi whether or not I thought it should be translated. So it was submitted to them. They thought, okay, they asked me to do a referee's report on the published book, which is a bit odd. You know, normally you do this on a manuscript, and you would suggest revisions. And in this case, it really wouldn't be suggesting revisions. It's just giving a yes or no. I think this is an important work to be translated. And of course, I said yes. It is an important work, and I thought it would be of great interest to readers in North America and the English-speaking world, and I said so. And then some time passed, and they said, okay, well, we're going to do this book, but the person that they had hired to do the translation dropped out of the project. He felt that it was going to take too long and wasn't going to pay enough money, and so there was just wasn't going to be remunerative for him. And did I know anybody else who would like to do it, or might I like to do it myself? And I thought about it for a while and said, well, that'd be an interesting project. I had lived in Montreal, and my French was pretty good, but I'd moved to Calgary where no one speaks French, and I felt like my French was atrophying a bit. I thought, well, okay, this would be a good way to kind of test myself. But I was also confident that I didn't want to do the work myself, and so I suggested that Nick come in, that his French was stronger than mine, and that we might divide the work and do it that way.
Right.
So actually, I just want to rewind a bit, because to add to what Bart was saying, just in case some of your readers don't know what the acronym ICAF means, it's the International Comic and Arts Forum, right? Bart, Forum, right?
Yeah, it started as festival, and then changed its name to a forum somewhere around 2000, I think.
Yeah, and so this was a major, let's say, exchange, especially between American academics and European artists, especially. There was a lot of crossover happening. And if I'm not mistaken, Bart, it was Guy Spielman head of the French department at Georgetown. That's right. That was one of the key drivers behind that. This conference, if you want to call it. And so it was there that exchange too. That I, for myself, when I started to go with Bart, actually. It became my first encounter with this kind of academic exchange, right? And so again, part of it is the timing, right? Again, this is late 90s, right? There's this kind of acceleration and progression towards an interest in what's going on in Europe right now. And again, coming out at the same time as, with MacLeod's book, starting a discussion about, hey, let's talk about comics in a certain kind of way. And, what's going on in Europe, and how are they talking about it in a certain kind of way? a focus on form, the beginning of, academic interest and dissertations about comics form starting to come along. And so I think this kind of perfect storm of events basically allows, again, brings the interest for Thierry's book to come out as as a continental alternative to MacLeod's dominant text at the time. And at the time when MacLeod's book came out, it was, I remember when I first read it, I was just like, it was quite visionary for me, because it was the first time I'd actually, here's an engagement trying to speak to it about comics on its own terms by someone who practices. But now, along comes, here's this alternative version coming from a very different tradition, using very specific language to draw in another crowd, right? And that was the challenge, and that was the interest for me. It was just like, okay, now, I'd like to become engaged in this process, especially of this cross-cultural exchange, right? And that's a lot of what that's a lot about my own academic interests as well, especially the Franco-American exchange with respect to cinema and comics. So when Bart asked me to join in on this project, I was thrilled to do so, because it became my way to participate into this larger discussion.
There's the one other thing I would mention is, because Nick is really, I think, correctly emphasizing the timing of all this. It's not just that ICAF existed at that time, although that was incredibly important, but it was also that the University Press of Mississippi had decided, under the directorship of Sita Srinivasan, to invest in the area of comic studies. And so they were really the one press in North America that was interested in this area. So comic studies that existed in the English-speaking world, only around a few scholars, Don Alt, David Kunzel, Tom Inge. And Tom Inge convinced the University Press of Mississippi to start publishing work on comics, including Joseph Wittig's book in 1989. And then in the early 2000s, late 90s and early 2000s, started to move more and more in that direction. They published Charles Hatfield's book. They published my book, for example. And those books were successful for them. And so they decided that they wanted to try and corner the market on comic studies. And this was very much them reaching out and saying, okay, maybe we should start translating these books. It will help us build this line even more forcefully. And while many presses have now started publishing work in comic studies, Mississippi is still sort of the flagship publisher, even though they've changed editors over time. And so Sita left, and we ended up working with Walter Biggins on this. But the press was always tremendously supportive of this kind of work in a way that many other university presses, I think, would have been reluctant to take on this work. I remember even in the kind of mid-2000s, some of the, bigger flagship state university presses, University of California Press and so on, were skeptical of work in comic studies. And so I think without Sita's foresight and Walter's commitment to the area as well, comic studies would not be in the place that it is today.
Wow, what an interesting perspective and experience. So what are at stake for such an ambitious project at the level of syntactical, semantic, ideological, or even beyond?
I think there's, Nick and I were discussing this the other day, trying to, look back now a decade and a half later and think through exactly what is the kind of major accomplishments of this book. And I think so much of it is at the level of opening up formal analysis to new ways of understanding. That Groensteen came to the study of comics with a tremendous understanding of semiotics, the history of semiotics, semiotic theory, and so on, but also a ridiculous knowledge of the state of comics publishing at the time. And just looking at the book again, his examples are always so wide-ranging and so well chosen. And I think some of them are even lost on English language readers, because he's referencing books that had tremendous influence in Europe but never been translated in the United States. And so they lose occasionally the sense of how strong his choices are. But he has, a kind of authorial understanding of the way comics work. He himself has been a comics publisher. He is a comics creator. He's written scripts for comics. So he has the understanding of a practitioner and as well a philosopher or theorist. And so most of the contribution, I wouldn't say is ideological. It's much more formal. It's much more his ability to explain some of the elements that authors seem to intuitively understand about the construction of comics that readers and critics sometimes do not understand. And that's kind of at the level of the formal organization of the page. I think his discussion, for instance, of the page and the page is the basis of meaning is really important. It's something that I focus in on when I'm teaching introductory comics classes to this day, to explain to students the way that we perceive the page, the way that the page is organized, is the fundamental question that cartoonists, when they sit down at their drawing board and they say, I need to design something that's visually interesting, kind of every new page has to be visually interesting and so on. And so to understand the work at that level, I think, is really crucial.
Mm-hmm. And I think also too, when now looking back, over 15 years, and citing especially, and we mentioned it in our introduction at the time, I think, some academics gave us grief for it, but a lot of the examples that Groensteen uses to illustrate his points, he's focusing on Franco-Belgian comics, especially, which, let's say, may not necessarily have the same circulation rate as they do now, especially in translation or even in digital circulation, right? Given the proliferation of comic scans that are available to readers today. In 1999 and hell, even in 2007, the ability to actually have to look at the examples, whether or not you could even read them or not, but just to look at them visually, today is now a lot more feasible than it was back then when any of this stuff was available for reference. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that came to my mind from listening to Bart just now too was when you think about Groensteen's focus on the panel and the page, one of the things, especially in using Franco-Belgian comics as his examples, is almost a very specific understanding of how of the context of production of Franco-Belgian comics as originally strips that later on, become comics pages that are turned into albums. So, like, there's a whole layer of thinking at the level of production of page construction, as that comes from a construction of like smaller elements that become a much larger whole, as opposed to an artist who's looking at an entire page and constructing something from scratch from a blank page. Again, that requires a certain kind of understanding of the historical context of comics production in a Franco-Belgian context. So thinking about it that way, and I was just kind of thinking about it right now, I had myself having a better understanding of how, something like a Tintin, like Hergé would create Tintin as originally serials in a magazine or first in a newspaper strip, and then each of those later on becoming an album, and then how those, the albums themselves are very different from their original incarnation because Hergé has reorganized the panels to create a certain kind of meaning, a certain kind of page flow, right, which is originally different from a strip flow on a weekly basis that turns into a page that's going to be, again, read in a continuous sitting, right? So I think a lot of that informs Groensteen's thinking as well in terms of semiotics, right? How all of this stuff as individual elements play to a larger whole. And so trying to get that across too, that's part of the unspoken translation. Like what Bart and I were trying to do obviously was, kind of fidelity to the text and the context, right. But there was so much in hindsight now in being, and again, especially to one of the challenges that I remember having reading his original text was the lack of illustrations as examples. It would be great to see what he's talking about, which was the strength of, for example, MacLeod. McLeod, everything was visual, so it was very easy to understand what he was talking about. Here, the density of the text, the vocabulary, even the style. The other thing that Groensteen was doing as well with System of Comics was actually engaging in an ongoing conversation, academic conversation, in the tradition of semiotics and visual semiotics, right? Even the name Système de la bande dessinée is a certain kind of echo to kind of like Bart's, and the Système de la mode and everything like that, because Groensteen's books, other books, it's as if stylistically they're slightly different, right? When he does his monographs, it's not the same. It's not the same as what he's doing here in System of Comics. And so that's been an interesting challenge as well. That was an interesting challenge getting into it. It was just like, okay, this is a different kind of style than what I read, in some of his earlier articles or even catalog exhibitions or things like that. So, in terms of like, okay, so how are we going to do this? Especially knowing that at first this is going to be, let's say a niche audience. And then who knows, like again, now 15 years later, exactly what's the longevity of the work? Especially now that comics has become a thing, right? An accredited field of studies, whereas it wasn't when it was just starting to be when we first started the translation.
Right. Well, Jacques Derrida was keenly aware of the philosophy and practice of translation, and especially the latter as an act of literature, when his theory, along with other continental theorists like Michel Foucault's, were translated into English. Derrida highlighted the process of translation as a complicated and sophisticated one, which first of all requires the translators to internalize a work written in a foreign language, then into the target language, and then somehow elevated it into something even more brilliant. And Walter Benjamin refers to the role of the translators as so important that they bestow an afterlife upon a work. So I was just wondering, was there any theory or a guiding principle in your minds when you began to work on the translation?
I think as Nick just said, we're really trying to be faithful to the structure of the language, the way that it was written, in a way that we've done 3 books now. And this is the first. And I think, I don't want to speak for Nick, but I think if we had the opportunity right now, we'd go back and do it again differently. That is, I was just recently teaching the work of Pierre Bourdieu to some first-year students, 17 and 18 years old. And I could really see them almost have a nervous breakdown. At one point, I had some of the text up on the screen behind me, and they said, one of my students said, this entire page that you're showing us is only one sentence. And I was like, yeah, okay, it's challenging. The way the French language is written with its ordinate clauses and so on. The dense kind of theoretical work that you find in Baudrillard and Derrida and Foucault and so on isn't the way that we write in English. And Groensteen writes that way as well. And we thought, well, it's his book. We need to be true to the way that he has structured this, even at the risk of having sentences that are overlong and that can be dense. And some of the reviews of the translation said, well, these sentences are overlong and they're dense. And I think in the end, we realized maybe we should have broken some of this up. And then when we did translations of the work of Jean-Paul Gabillet and Thierry Groensteen, we very much did that. We said, we kind of told them in advance, we're going to break up some of this to make it more readable in English. And that's the lesson that we learned from this book. At the same time, as I say, we might want to do it differently. One of the things I realized is that we'd done it in a way that a lot of other translators have as well. So we agreed fairly early on that whenever Groensteen cited a scholar that had already been translated, whether it was Roland Barthes or Gilles Deleuze, that we would go, rather than doing a new translation of Deleuze, we would go and find that translation and substitute that. But in order to do that, we kind of had to do a back-of-the-envelope translation, so we even knew what part of the book we were looking for. And whenever we found them, I would go back to the library and start looking these things up, and we kept getting these confirmations. Oh no, this is the way it's done. That Deleuze has been done in this way, and so on. So we felt like we were on the right track. We never felt that we'd gone horribly astray. But at the same time, when I sit down to read it today, I'm like, oh, this is, we could have used a semicolon here, we could have used a period there, we could have broken these things up and made the language more readable.
Yeah, I agree with Bart. He can speak for me on this one. I would do it, approach it differently. But again, not making excuses. We were working in a similar tradition as Bart's Bourdieu example shows. And the Deleuze, I've read Deleuze as well, is both his volumes that were translated into English, and they're just as dense and just as hard to get into, again, with these pages that are one sentence long. If you've ever worked with a Zerti keyboard, my usual joke is that you can tell that the French don't like periods because you actually have to press shift and then another key to get the period. The comma is just a one stroke key. So we made the decision. I think part of it too was because it was Groensteen. He has had a certain position already in the field, and we wanted to be in our own way faithful to his work and his style. So it's something that we decided we lived with. If there was any guiding principle for the way we worked on it, it wasn't so much a philosophy. It wasn't so much any of the philosophers, but more of a working, let's say, of a workflow, which was inspired by the cartoonists Dupuy and Berberian. Charles Berberian and Philip Dupuy, where each of us would work on sections of the book, then we would exchange them with each other, and then work them through again, re-exchange them with each other, and then get them to a point where we were happy with them before it went to copy editing. So it was very much a mixture of both of our work, but each of us had started something, but by the time it ended, it became a synthesis of each of our labor.
The other thing is that we were working with Thierry because we had a relationship with him for having known him for more than a decade at that time. And so we were sending him drafts of the material and sometimes questions as well. I remember while I was working on this, it was in the summer, and I had rented with my wife a gîte just outside of Grenoble, and was spending the summer there. And so we kind of get up in the morning, work on the translation, do a couple of pages, and then we kind of get on with our day in the afternoon. And there were moments in the book, he doesn't write in a very idiomatic way, but there certainly are French idioms in the book that I had never encountered. And at one point he's describing, I can't even remember which cartoonist style, but he calls it a bordello espagnol. And I had, I could kind of figure out what that meant, but I was like, wow, what is that? How would you, we just don't have that phrase in English. And I remember walking through the countryside like 4 or 5 days in a row, like just thinking, like spending an hour of my life, like, how am I translating this? How am I translating this? How am I translating this? And finally sending him an email and saying, well, we've got like these 10 examples of what we could do. And he just said, well, let's just strike that entire parenthetical aside. It doesn't add anything anyways. And I was like, what? Can't just drop this out. It's I've spent a week thinking about it, and it turned out that he didn't even care. So that was a big eye opener for me. Is you do sort of internalize these things, and you struggle with exactly what is going to be the term. We were also very aware that we were introducing terms into the English comic studies vocabulary that would be taken up, that we knew this was a permanent change. So our discussion about braiding versus weaving, which would be the better term to introduce. He uses the term mise en page, and we thought, do we just leave mise en page as mise en page? There is no great English phrase for that. In film studies, mise en scène has come to mean mise en scène, that English scholars of film just adopted the French term. We thought, okay, fine, Scholars know what mise-en-scène is, so they'll know what mise-en-page is. So we're not going to, because every possible solution to that was awkward. And so you're just making the book sort of worse. But there was a real sense as we were going through it that we really had to make sure that we nailed some of these things down. So general and restricted arthrology, I remember a review that, complained about our use of the term arthrology. And, I thought about it for a while. And I'm like, I'm not sure what else we're supposed to do. In French, it's arthrology. Like, it's exactly the same term. He explains where the term is coming from in the Greek and Latin, and we explain where it's coming from. And, it doesn't sound that elegant, I guess, but it doesn't sound that elegant in French either. I mean, it's it's a technical, jargonistic term, but I think people read the book and understand where it's coming from and why we use it. And, and a lot of scholars have taken that term up.
Right. Well, translating fiction and poetry is one thing, but translating theory is way difficult than that. So if I ask you guys to make a summary, what is the most difficult thing or any aporia for this translation that you can recall so far?
The challenge of introducing new vocabulary into the English language that had very specific French antecedents and very, and then, again, with origins that are very clearly explained in the French text. But, are they translatable? Are they readable? Especially given, again, this was our first, essay, our first pass steps into this world with a well-regarded artist. And so the if you want to call it the pressure of thinking that, okay, whatever word that we choose, it's either we got to live or die by it, right? This, again, depending on the longevity of the translation, this is going to be something that's going to be part of the lexicon from here on in. So we want to make sure that it's right. We want to be comfortable with it. And also, hence, I think a lot of our interplay with Thierry to make sure that he'd be comfortable with it. Again, I remember sweating about braiding versus weaving, right? Weaving, because braiding, you immediately in the English language, you think of hair. And, the idea of that actually as a visual makes a lot of sense, but it's hard not to think about it just in terms of hair. So,
right.
to think about it and how it works in, as part of a comic system, then became like, okay, well, we got to stick with this and hope this floats, right? And same with, again, Bart was talking about arthrology, spatiotopia, very, very specific words that, again, had never really been used in the field of comic studies prior to that point. So introducing these terms into the field, there was, again, it's stressful, right? Because again, knowing that already that it's theory, and then it's going to be, first, read by a niche audience that's going to, get the knives out, and then, and then basically figure out whether or not it's going to be used or not, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, how the longevity of these kinds of terms is dependent on how they get picked up over generations.
One of the challenges I thought was interesting about translating a scholarly work that I hadn't thought about before we took it on was the frustration at times of translating something that I didn't agree with. And so I wanted to fight with him. I mean, there was, a few points in the book where I'm like, no, I think this is wrong. I would sit down, if I was at a conference and he made this claim, I would push back in the question and answer period. And that hadn't ever occurred to me, that I was like, oh, I'm just sort of signing off on something here. And, I could say, it's not my book. It's not my book. I mean, this is his argument. But it was a weird sort of experience in that way of surrendering your own writing to someone else's drive and consciousness there. And so, yeah, I remember thinking that was a very peculiar experience. When we did the next book that we translated, Jean-Paul Gabier's of Comics and Men, there was actually a moment where I wrote to him and I said, this entire page is historically incorrect. And he says, and he wrote back and he said, yes, feel free to change that. your work and other work that's come out after I wrote this has proven this wrong, right? There's been more research in this area. And so my understanding at the time was incorrect, and I'd much rather be correct. But it is a kind of challenge for translators in that way that, you're like, one of the reasons I'm translating this is because I think it's an important book, but it's certainly, I've never read anybody else's book that I've agreed with 100% of the time. And so that was just an interesting mental phenomenon, I thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, what could be the benefits and limitations for English-speaking audience to read a translated theory like Groensteen's?
Well, I think the benefit of opening up, transcontinental, international ways of thinking is absolutely crucial. I think one of the drawbacks of Groensteen's book for some readers is the fact that he's engaging in arguments with scholars who came before him whose work has not been translated. And so some of what he has to say and some of the brilliance of what he has to say is lost on readers. And so when you go back to the discussion of the panel and the page, when he's talking about semiotic theory, he's saying, well, look, a lot of semioticians want to break this down to the panel as a base unit, but even intrapanel elements, individual lines and characters, and so on. And he's making the argument that, that's kind of too narrow, and we need to pull back from that. The appropriate lens is taking a step back from that. But in order to get there, he's telling you about all of these other scholars in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s who have developed all of these arguments. If you're a French reader engaged in these debates, I think you would follow along and say, yes, I've read that, and I can see where he's coming from and how his position is the end result here of decades of thinking on this topic. For an English language reader, this is it. This is the beginning of that debate. And so I think they're kind of thrown in into the deep water and can be a bit lost. It's one of the reasons that I decided with Anne Miller that we would do a book of the French comics theory reader that did for Leuven University Press, where we got a few dozen kind of important articles that had never been translated and translate them and sort of bring them back much later and say, this is what you should have read before you read Groensteen, because it's the type of things that he had been reading. But the opening up of these perspectives is incredibly vital. I'm asked if I'm on a roundtable at a comic studies conference. I'm typically asked, what do you think is the book that's most necessary in the field of comic studies right now? And I always say, the Japanese comics theory reader. I'm very aware from my colleagues who work on Japanese comics that there is a tremendously sophisticated theoretical debate going on about this work that I am completely unaware of, because I don't read the language. And I would love for someone to take on the work of translating these key Japanese theorists and so on, because reading Japanese comics has been tremendously eye-opening for North American creators. I think reading Japanese theory would have the same effect in Europe and in North America.
And I think to add to everything that Bart just said, it's become one of the things that I've become more and more appreciative of the more and more I read translations, is the translator's introduction. And I think a lot of the information that, that Bart was talking about, the context of the work, right, that is lost if this is point zero for, especially for an English language audience to read Thierry's work, is that, well, hold on. From a translator's point of view, it's our job to not only translate the text, but also to translate the context, to situate it in a certain kind of way so that to have that level of attention to the reading audience, not so much in terms of, hey, linguistically we're translating from French to English, but we're also at least translating the historical context, the reception of the work, the initial arrival of the work, and the debates that it is engaged with, so that at least there is some form of understanding of where it's coming from. And I think that's an important aspect of the translator's introduction that, over 15 years I've now come to really appreciate and think is a crucial element of any translation.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Bart and Nick, for sharing these valuable insights on translating theory with us today. It was a great pleasure to have talked to both of you today.
This is my pleasure.
The pleasure is mine as well, Claire. Thanks very much for your kind words about our work.